es un gusto muy grande para nosotros que Heather haya aceptado venir desde tan lejos. Es su primera vez en Latinoamérica y entonces estamos muy contentos de todo lo que vamos a aprender de su larga experiencia. Yo voy a contarles, para los que no la conocen, algunas cosas de ella. Muchos han leído ya sus trabajos. Actualmente Heather es profesora emérita de Demografía Económica y del Desarrollo en el Institute of Education del University College de la Universidad de Londres del Reino Unido. Ella ha sido entre 2003 y 2010 directora del Centro de Estudios Longitudinales allí, y también ha sido investigadora y directora de un estudio sumamente importante para el mundo y en particular para los objetivos de este seminario, que es el análisis de la cohorte del Millennium del Reino Unido. También, bueno, su investigación ha sido muy vasta en temas de familia, de mercado laboral, de género, de desarrollo infantil. Ha coordinado también la Red Europea de Estudios de Cohorte de Niños, y también ha sido fundadora de la Sociedad para el Estudio para los Estudios Longitudinales y del Curso de Vida, y actualmente es integrante de la Academia Británica. Hoy nos va a hacer la presentación sobre prácticas de crianza y desarrollo infantil, qué podemos aprender de los estudios de cohorte. Y bueno, entonces Heather va a hablar por aproximadamente 40 minutos y después vamos a dejar el espacio para preguntas. So Heather, do you want to start?
Thank you. You've been told my objectives.
Hay que sacar el micrófono.
Oh.
Okay? Can you hear me?
¿Puedes subir un poquito?
Testing, 1, 2, 3. Okay. So thank you very much for the invitation for my first visit to South America. Thank you also for the challenge of talking to you about parenting, which is not something I've focused on too much before, but I hope we will together make a journey through a new literature and a new subject by using the Millennium Cohort study, which I do know something about, to illustrate how this idea has been implemented in data collection and in research. So I'm going to start by a great oversimplification of the story of child development. We can think of a child as having its biological origins and its social context, and somewhere in the middle is the child's home life, the parents, the mother and or the father, and it's the activities of these parents rather than their place in the social structure that the literature on parenting focuses. But this is only one part of a big picture. Parenting itself is extremely complicated. There are many aspects of parenting. There are usually two parents. Child development is complicated and complex and itself has many dimensions. And although I'll be focusing on influences running from the parents to the child, there are influences running in many directions in this story. We're going to try and look at a corner of a big tapestry. The influences are not just running from parent to child, but they run all over the place. So what do parents do when they are influencing their child's development? They nurture their child's physical health and its growth, but also its eventual independence. The parent birds hatch an egg in a nest, and teach the little bird, they feed the little bird and then they teach the little bird to fly away. And the human parents have got that job too. Meanwhile, they transmit know-how, they transmit social norms, they transmit their values, they transmit aspects of the culture, and most importantly, they transmit their resources in the economic and social structure. And they don't always do good to their children either. Some parents do harm. In the studies I'll be talking about, there are a large number of parental activities which sometimes at least get considered as parenting activities. On the left-hand side, top left-hand corner, there are things that parents do with their children. Then there's the structuring of family life, the setting of rules, the implementation of rules and discipline. There's the statement of values and objectives. On this side of I'm starting listing activities which don't necessarily get called parenting by all authors. Breastfeeding, smoking. Smoking in pregnancy could be regarded as a form of negative parenting. Smoking in the presence of your children could be regarded as bad parenting. Smoking anyway could be regarded as bad parenting because it's setting a bad example. Then there's a list of other elements here which have been considered, sometimes, but not by all authors. Going down to activities, the damaging activities that some parents inflict upon their children, difficult to observe in social surveys. If you can see different little colours on the side of these items, they reappear in categories that have been used by the researchers. I'm going to quote, to categorise the type of activity that is considered to be parenting. Why are we interested in studying parenting? One very good reason is that it enables us to get a better understanding of the quality of family life, of the quality of relationships between parents and their children. But particularly for the literature I'm going to move on to, people are interested in parenting because they think it affects how children turn out. It affects children's outcomes. And in particular, it is considered that the different sorts of behaviours of parents with different levels of social and economic resources mediate or account for the different outcomes of rich and poor children. If parenting behaviour is the vehicle through which social inequalities are reproduced, it may also be the vehicle through which policies can redress those social inequalities. And it is particularly attractive to politicians who get the idea that it's easier to redress differences in parenting behaviour than to redress differences in social and economic resources. So this is a line of thought that both economics and psychology thinks of parents as investing in their children and producing good outcomes. And the idea that parental investment is of interest and important, it's often thought to focus on the very early years when the children's brains are more malleable and before other institutions come to play in also shaping the child's development. So at least in the UK, there's a big controversy about how important parenting is. And we'll have a look at one study on which the claim has been based that what parents do is more important than who they are. That it's the activities in the home rather than the resources in the home that generate, that are important for predicting children's outcomes. But before we turn to the particular evidence collected in the UK, here are some general considerations about how one might be, one or you may be wanting to collect evidence about parenting behaviour. Some of the evidence that parenting behaviour, parenting makes a difference comes from detailed, very intensive parenting intervention studies, which do at least show that you can teach bad parents, poor parents, better techniques, but they don't usually last long enough to see whether that makes a long-term difference to the children. If you're studying parenting, you can get the information from a number of sources. You can ask mothers, you can ask fathers, you can ask the teachers, you can ask your survey researchers to observe how the parents and the children interact. And you can ask the children themselves when they're old enough to tell you whatever old enough means. Whether when they're teenagers, they certainly have their own opinions and will probably be quite willing to tell you. And when they're adults, they can be asked to look back on their experience of their relationships with their parents when they were children. Now, the outcomes that can be linked to evidence about parents' behaviour include measures of children's cognitive development, of their psychological adjustment, and of their physical growth. And researchers have combined all these different sources of evidence in a variety of different ways. There's usually, you don't just collect one variable, which is called parenting. There are many pieces of information which researchers combine in different ways into scales and averages, selecting in different ways. And they also use different modelling strategies which may reflect the discipline that they've come from. So large multi-purpose longitudinal surveys are a good place to start when you need multiple pieces of information covering many domains of life and following your subjects through time. But there are some limitations to what such surveys can do. There are limitations to longitudinal surveys in general because they cost a lot of money. But more than that, there's a limit to the amount of time that you can impose on your respondent burden. So that limits how much you can collect too. The instruments in multi-purpose surveys are of interest to a number of disciplines who compete for time on this limited vehicle, and there are inevitably trade-offs between what's the breadth and the depth of the coverage of any one particular topic. And particularly on the subject of parenting, there are other limits to what society as a whole, or the people who impose ethical standards on data collection, will say it's acceptable to ask people about. So in general, you can't go out and ask families if they've stopped beating their children. or if they've ever beaten them. That's just too threatening a question, and it's also likely to lose cooperation in a longitudinal survey. They won't talk to you again if they've been asked once something embarrassing, and they think they're being judged for the quality of their behaviour. So the solution sometimes suggested that the interviewers can go to the home and report back on how good the parenting is, how good the mother's relationship is with her child. It is also difficult. The interviewers may not feel comfortable about doing that. The ethical authorities may not feel that it's an acceptable form of behaviour for a research organisation. And the alternative of finding out about the children in your cohort, about if they have come to the notice of, say, if family troubles have been noticed by either the school or the social work, linking administrative records, as was mentioned earlier on, that too may not be ethically acceptable. If you have to tell the families you're working with what sort of information will be added in, they may not want their social work records to be investigated. So now we can turn to how the Millennium Cohort study has collected information about parenting and connected it with information about child development. I'm going to be telling you more about the Millennium Cohort study in another session, but very briefly, it is a study of the whole of the United Kingdom, including the 3 smaller countries, Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland. It started off with over 19,000 children born over a year from year 2000 onwards, and it's attempting to follow them throughout their lives. So far there have been studies that we can analyse at 9 months, 3 years, 5 years, 7 years and 11, and the 14-year-olds are being surveyed right now. The 17-year-old survey is being planned, and the intention is that it should be followed into adulthood. It's one of 5 national birth cohort studies in the UK. I'll tell you a bit about some of the earlier ones in a minute. It certainly is a multi-purpose and multi-subject study, and this is just a very brief summary of the types of information that are collected about the children and about their parents during the first 5 sweeps. I'm not going to read it out, but you name it, it's probably there. The questions about parenting are derived from questions to both fathers and mothers. This is a summary of some of the information we've collected about or from the fathers. 86% of them were present when the child was born, which is a sign of the times. It would not have been anything like that 50 years before. And I don't know what it's like in Uruguay, but this is an indicator of father's involvement at least 9 months after conception. Even when the child is born, these British fathers take quite a substantial role in baby care when the children are 9 months old. And as they're into age 5 and age 7, we still see quite a lot of fathers, not the majority, but involved in childcare. By age 7, 1/4 of the fathers had left the cohort child. They'd moved on to another home or another partnership. But those who had parted company with the cohort child, 2/3 of them remained in some form of contact. So the father's bit of parenting is not negligible. Here's a couple of slides describing some of the activities in my top left-hand corner, coded gold. Activities with the child. Reading to the child is a sort of star variable that everybody uses. It's 80% of the mothers reported reading with the child at age 3 and age 5. Plus at age 7, the children are all at school and can read for themselves, but still the vast majority. Fathers are also fairly active in reading to the child. Also in the gold corner, but not so much studied, except by people interested in obesity, are the activities of physical activities with their parents. And here we have a role where the fathers take the lead, which is they're more likely to play physical games and sports than mothers. Feminists would say, oh well, fathers only do the things that are fun. The information, extensive information on rules, discipline, evolves as the child gets older. These families vary a lot in how much they describe themselves as having structures, but regular bedtime becomes the norm at 3 and 5, not for babies. Admitting to physical punishment of smacking is quite rare, and becomes down to 8% at age 7. And by the time the children are 11, the questions arise about how much of their time is supervised. So you can see that parenting is something that evolves with the age of the child, and as they're moving towards flying the nest, some of these parents are preparing for their children to cope without them. Briefly tell you a bit about what we've learned from the 2 of the previous cohort studies, which didn't have so many visits when children were in early childhood. Age 7 was the first childhood follow-up study of the 1958 cohort. But they do have the undoubted advantage of their cohort children now being grown up, and the 45-year-olds in the 1958 cohort were asked about parental abuse in a confidential retrospective self-completion study as part of a biomedical follow-up. And those who reported parental abuse had generally poorer mental health as adults, as you will not be surprised to learn, but which is quite surprising to be able to document. We've also got evidence of poor parenting being associated with poorer mental health in both the 1958 and 1970 cohorts, and poorer eventual educational attainment in the 1970 cohort. So the next slide is also about the findings of another longitudinal study, not one of the national birth cohorts, but of a study called EPI. Effective provision of preschool education, which is a longitudinal study which recruited 3-year-old children just before the beginning of the millennium, so they're born in the middle of the 1990s. And it's a study of school effectiveness, so it was very structured around children either being in an early education setting or in a control group who were living at home with their parents. And the results of this is being followed right through, they're still being followed into the end of secondary school, but the sort of famous results of the first survey was much declared by its authors and by the delighted politicians. what parents do is more important than who they are. These are the estimates on which this statement is based. The yellow lines are estimates of effect sizes going up to 0.7 for of a combined home learning inventory whose components are given on the right hand side of the slide on literacy and numeracy at age 5. The other predictors in the model are socioeconomic status, the mother's education and family income are relatively unimportant in this model, which was a multi-level model controlling for the class, the structure of the class and the teaching that the children also had. So this is a very influential finding, and the EPI team had input into the Millennium Cohort. They collaborated with us, and we used lots of their questions. So here is one of the results that we get in the Millennium Cohort for child outcomes at age 3. Because this is a multi-purpose survey for many users, it's not confined to any particular scientist to produce the results. This was an early and very sophisticated analysis by the economist John Ermish, who had 6 child outcomes at 3 related to a set of parenting variables which included the home learning terms used in EPI, plus fetal growth, which he used to represent nutrition in the womb, which he considers to be part of parenting behavior. And so the colour codes, which you should be beginning to recognise, the yellow things are estimates of impacts on these 2 outcomes, vocabulary and in behaviour outcome, from activities with the child. The 2 different coloured bars reflect whether he controlled for social structure or not. The long bars are the kind of crude association between the parenting terms and the outcomes. The short bars are the estimates when you allow for the fact that the social structure has also been responsible for some of the differences in the parenting terms. Anyway, he uses these parameters to address the question of how much of a gap between rich and poor children is accounted for by parenting. And of course, a lot of it is accounted for if you take the long versions of these estimates, like 2/3 of the gap between rich and poor children are accounted for by the parenting terms. But if you also control for, if you hold constant, as it were, the socioeconomic predictors of parenting behaviour, the contribution of parenting to the rich-poor child gap goes down to about 1/5 to 1/3. At age 5, there are quite a lot of analyses. This one comes from Liz Washbrook, who is a young economist at Bristol University, who was commissioned by a member of Parliament called Frank Field to data mine the Millennium Cohort. And although she's produced more sophisticated analyses since then, I'm taking this from her first report because it shows you the huge number of variables that she put into the pot to look for associations between parenting and 3 types of outputs. Outputs that I've got here, outcomes at 5, combined cognitive score, a total difficulty score in the strength and difficulties question, and the absence. Well, the behaviour is not bad behaviour. This is absence of behaviour difficulties. The health score is the absence of health problems. The colour coding comes from Washbrook's classification of these huge numbers of terms. The pluses and minuses show where she found a statistically significant independent effect in a multiple regression which had all of these terms in it, plus all of these social structural terms. 154 variables she had in this regression. So the magnitude of a particular coefficient is not interesting, but different outcomes are more likely to be associated with different cognitive terms, with different parenting variables. The health variables are least associated, and in fact she had a fourth outcome that she looked at, which was body mass index, because of the interest in obesity, which was had very little association with parenting terms. This slide comes from those regressions. It summarises the contribution of all of those parameters connecting parenting with cognitive, behaviour and health outcomes into the components of which you might think of as either parenting or structural, and depending on where you draw the line between parenting activities and other family resources, you don't really get anything more than 50% of the rich-poor child gap accounted for by parenting behaviour. What's perhaps more interesting is that the behavioural outcome is more sensitive to parental warmth and sensitivity. The cognitive outcome is more sensitive to home learning activities, which is, it makes sense, it's not surprising. Her sponsor wanted to claim that parenting accounted for virtually all of the rich-poor difference, and he, in the report he used, he said that virtually all of the difference between rich and poor children was accounted for by what he called key drivers. At that point, he'd added in parental education as being a key driver. So if you thought of everything apart from family resources and family structure, those variables do account for more than half of the rich-poor gap. But if you treat as parenting just the first three colours, the learning, the warmth and the rules, it's less than 40%. So you can pick your definition and take your choice. There's not one answer. Various other people studying age 5 outcomes addressed a similar question. A paper with Kathy Silver was a co-author with Lorraine Dean, who came up with about 25% of a differently defined rich-poor gap associated with parenting. Kiernan and Metzar came up with 40 to 45%, yet another rich-poor gap associated with a very, very comprehensive list of variables for their parenting index, which included information on nutrition, but did not include any information on what the fathers were doing. But still, it's also, some of you may be interested to know that these exercises found no moderation effects. It was mediation, not total, but quite a lot of mediation. But it didn't. The parenting effects weren't dependent on how rich the parents were. Kiernan and Huerta showed that parenting mediated the pathway from maternal depression to age 3 outcomes. At age 7, I'll try to speed up, we have a similar sort of picture that estimates connected with home learning are not as important as estimates connected with structure. These are an analysis of cognitive outcomes at 7. The structured home environment is a little more important than it was at age 3, but not that much more important. Just summarising is another analysis of academic scores of the 7-year-olds, predictors or risk factors of which were significantly related to child outcomes. So some of the parenting ones are in there, but they are not the whole story, and these things coded green to do with values. Social structure were more important. Now here's one to do with parental education. Your father can't read, you don't do very well at school, for example. There have also been, how much time have I got? Turning to behavioural outcomes at age 7, there have been quite a lot of people working on the subscales that can be derived from the Strengths and Difficulties questionnaire. This is an example of a structure equation model which has got all of the 4 subscales as outcomes. Social advantage, which I don't know, it's green on your screen, it's supposed to be green, a latent variable reflecting social advantage, maternal mental health on the left-hand side, and these basic predictors are very important in connecting the child's origins with their scores at age 7. There are pathways all over the diagram which I haven't shown because there are too many lines on it already, but the significant pathways with correlations of about 0.2 connect both of these with all of these 4. But what we have in this particular paper, in the model, we looked at the aspirations expressed by 7-year-old children as possible predictors of their behavioural score at age 7. We looked at the child's cognitive ability as measured at 5, and 2 variables connected with the parenting battery. A set of home learning variables, the reading, singing, those kind of things, and which turn up in every article. I picked this particular paper because it looked for a connection between the values that the parents were asked about at age 3 and whether they were connected in any way with how their children were turning out behaviourally. So in this interstices of the model, these intermediate pathways, the really strong connection is from social disadvantage to child cognitive ability, and child cognitive ability is a strong predictor of the age 7 behaviour outcomes. The rest of the pathways, where significant, are relatively weak, but they're not totally absent. Home learning has some connection with the 2 externalizing types of problems. A parent wants their child to be popular. That is connected with the child wanting to be rich and famous. That's what extrinsic means when they are asked what they want to be when they grow up. A parent wanting to instill religious values, that is connected with emotional symptoms or avoidance of emotional symptoms. The green line is good news, the red line is bad news. So collecting all this information about parents' activities was not a complete waste of time, but it did not completely zap the influences of social disadvantage. The same team of which I'm part has looked at various other of the age 3 parenting variables as predictors of these outcomes. Parental warmth is good news. Parental harsh discipline doesn't seem to make much difference to the children up to age 7. So this rapid survey is not comprehensive in that there is research going on that I haven't covered, and there's plenty of other things that could be done in the future when more information accumulates. Breastfeeding is an important topic in its own right, which my successor as Millennium Cohort Director is doing some important work. Other people have looked at whether the positive associations of breastfeeding are spurious or not. I think they partly are, and they can partly find a biological benefit, but whether you call that parenting is beyond the scope of this talk. Infant attachment. There are complaints that the age 9-month survey did not have the kind of intensive, didn't collect enough to be able to detect infant attachment. And they certainly did not have enough time to take every one of the 19,000 children into a psychologist's office to do an observation of the strange room experience. So other surveys may do better on infant attachment. For example, the German survey is videoing infants, but that's on a smaller scale, and it's become and they've not only got the money to do it, but they have got ethical permission to do it. I haven't gone into the differences between mothers and fathers or girls and boys in this. I think in some variables and some outcomes, particularly the conduct problems, there are big differences between girls and boys. But, I haven't shown those. Grandparents, we know something about how the grandparents interact with the children. That's quite complicated because it's tied in with them being a substitute source or a supplementary source of daycare for working parents. I'm not saying grandparents aren't important, I just haven't put them in this talk. Now, childcare was one of the variables in Washbrook's 154 variable exercise, but it's not the only one that's failed to find any statistical association with child outcomes. So that's why that's not there. Employment and parental leave is a topic. How much the parents are involved in schooling was a very important predictor for the studies that took place in the 1950s and 1970s. Well, the 1946 cohort and the 1958 cohort, the teacher's assessment of the parents' involvement in the child's education turned out to be highly predictive. I'm not sure that that's going to appear in the Millennium cohort because it's because there's a social respectability bias in responses given to that question. There is a study which I haven't told you about in any great detail done by Lucinda Platt about how parental breakup impinges upon, has a long-term impact, perhaps eventually on the child, but on the mother's parenting competence, which is quite interesting. We don't know how these children are going to behave as parents in the future, but I think we all know that parenting behaviour is probably learnt at home, so we'll in due course be able to see. Some of you may have spotted that in more than one of the slides I put up, television viewing, which is thought to be bad, actually is positively associated with cognitive outcomes. And why that is, we don't yet know, but it's quite interesting. So the summary of the summary is that parenting variables are shown to have significant independent associations with measures of children's cognitive and non-cognitive ability. These are observational data, so we can't be sure that it's causal. How big the effects that are estimated depend on what you count as parenting, what else is held constant, what the outcome is, and how old the child is, and possibly whether it's a girl or boy. The home learning environment is more important for cognitive and academic outcomes, parental warmth and style more important for child mental health. The evidence that parenting mediates income and mental health gaps in children's development. There is evidence that it mediates, but less that it moderates. Something which I should have put right at the beginning is that for all the enormous numbers of variables that have been thrown into enormous numbers of regressions, a lot of variation between children remains unexplained. They are laws unto themselves. These are not deterministic laws. Children conform to some extent to the law of random results, which is the most comforting thing that a parent can know. And it's also the case that I haven't really gone into the attempts that some people have made, including Lydia in this room, to allow for feedback on the parents of the way the children behaves. The mediation or gap accounting ranged from 20 to 50%, according to how you define the gaps. But the policy implications of this depend on whether it will be feasible to reduce the so-called deficits in parenting behaviour without also affecting the deficits in resources which you are trying to compensate for. So, although parents' attitudes and behaviour look attractive to politicians to talk about and infuriate some of their critics by saying they are blaming the victims, we should avoid concluding that parenting is a panacea. And we should be careful that interventions to improve parenting are not intrusive, and they should recognise that there are economic and cultural constraints that limit and explain why parents display these deficits. But the multidimensional nature of the relationships that we have discovered suggests to me that any interventions shouldn't just be on parenting, but they should involve combining in the domains of health, housing, healthcare, and income support, and employment provisions for parents, and for schools and parents to work together, which I think we're quite keen to do. So parenting is not unimportant. It's sometimes stressful, and that parents undertake these activities needs to be praised rather than blamed, just like naughty children. For data collection, the first thing to remember is that you need to keep the cooperation of your informants. Don't ask them questions about which they are uncomfortable. And within a multi-purpose survey, the questions should be acceptable and ethical. They should be economical of survey time and of respondent time, which is almost the same thing. It's not worth having questions in there if they're not going to predict future outcomes. And this includes variables that describe what everybody does. There's no variance in the variable. It doesn't pay its way on its time on the instrument. You may find yourself messing about with standard inventories, and you will have to choose how often to repeat questions in repeated surveys and how many informants to ask about the same thing. And if you triangulate, you will not get the same answer. So do you think that is a blessing or not? I would hope if you're doing this, you've got time to do your own piloting, informed by what's worked elsewhere. And I would hope that you've got time to triangulate the different sources of informants, if that's ethically possible. So, I think I've said all that, and I think I've run out of time.
Okay, thank you. Ahora abrimos un espacio para preguntas y comentarios. No sé.
I'll break the ice. Heather, you mentioned something about this in passing, but what am I doing? I see. We need a mic. Will this work? No? All right. Okay. Heather, you mentioned something in passing about the effects of trying to alter parenting practices through educational programs or interventions of various sorts. And I think it is worth pointing out that in the U.S., I did a review of random assignment programs to affect parenting attitudes for various kinds of interventions, and the result was that most of these programs don't generally work. That in effect you can't really modify. It's not too surprising, but in 10-week courses or even in the nurse visiting programs that go on for several years, you cannot alter parents' attitudes enough to make a difference for, let's say, schooling outcomes. There's some positive effects on reducing maltreatment, but nothing on schooling as far as I could tell in the survey that I did. That leads me to ask, the question, should we be paying so much attention to parenting practices as we do? We know that they are associated with various things, but if we can't alter those practices through interventions that involve at least didactic approaches, then what policy significance does this kind of work have?
Well, I think that reduction in maltreatment is a good thing in itself.
Yeah.
And that one shouldn't be overly focused on academic outcomes.
Okay.
But I'm not very surprised that where you have got evidence on long-term outcomes that you don't pick up very much.
Hi. So I guess my question is, because I was always uncomfortable with the idea of intervening on parenting. I do see the point that it's kind of victim blaming, and also if you want to create interventions which don't seem to work much anyways, they're quite stigmatizing as well. And who's going to take them up anyways if you label them parenting classes and however you go. And you talked about sort of social constraints that we forget about often, sort of parents like have behaviors within their environment, within the constraints of their environment. And my question, I guess, is how the way that we collect data is on households, and we never. I mean, we look at parenting because we can collect information that, and we talked a lot about families are constrained, but it always stays anecdotal and what we think based on theory. But how do you think we could integrate more of this kind of wider? So when you're looking at the development model, we're looking at the child, we're looking at the family. Sometimes we look at the schools maximum. But how could we integrate more of those variables into our longitudinal studies? Can we? Maybe not.
I think that the constraints on poor families are what's accounting for the other 60% of the gap. And actually, I would suggest that the interventions shouldn't just be, say, a home nurse doing parenting, but it should be the housing officer, the income support person, or whatever they're now going to be called, if any. There should be coordination with the schools. The support need. The problems are multifaceted, so the solutions need to be what we call joined up, and not picking on something which looks like victim blaming.
I have two related questions. I was struck by your bullet point about parenting mediates but doesn't moderate social class, essentially. And so one of the questions is, what were you looking for, or how would it moderate? What kinds of effects would you consider would illustrate that it would moderate, the things that you didn't find? But also, if we're saying that these parenting behaviors mediate, then the implication of that is that it's not a perfect association between the social class and the parenting behaviors, so that in some cases you see parenting behaviors that aren't reflective of the general trend of that group. So my question is, has the study tried to look at ways in which, or cases in which, or patterns in which that you find that you have surprisingly good parenting, say, in people that are socially disadvantaged, and what are the factors that might account for that, which might turn out to be a relevant question for intervening.
I think there certainly are parents who buck the trend, because these aren't very well determined models anyway. I can't offhand think of any analyses that have gone into great depth to see if this kind of parenting resilience, as it were, can be explained away. There's something in the work of Vanessa Moulton, who was the first author of SEM, where she's got stuff on the grandparents. A working class child with a mother who's been socially downwardly mobile seems to benefit from the heritage of the middle class grandparents, for example. Now, as far as moderation goes, I suppose the model would be, does good parenting only matter if you're poor, or only matter if you're rich? Nobody's found that, although it has been looked for. But something of the sort has been found but not published in the early education relationship. Nobody wants to believe that early education does not impact on academic outcomes at age 7 or age 11. You can't find it. Because in this cohort, they all, or 85–90% of them, had early education. So there's an example of the invariance problem. But children of the least educated mothers do seem to show some benefit from, or some further penalty if they were one of the small number that didn't get early education. So there does seem to be an interaction or a moderation.
That was found in the U.S. daycare study too, where the families that were the lowest social class families benefited the most from the quality daycare in their language and cognitive skills. I just was saying that finding, a related finding, was in the U.S. daycare study, where the most disadvantaged families, the children benefited the most from the quality daycare because it had a bigger impact on their language development, whereas the families that kind of were more middle-class families didn't benefit from the daycare environment particularly.
Well, they didn't do any better than they would have done at home.
Exactly.
I realize that the earlier cohort studies, 1946, 58, 70, didn't assess anywhere near as many variables. But were there enough variables in common among those studies to enable you to compare secular changes and conceivably relate it to things like the much wider distribution of early education now than would have been true earlier? You did mention something about fathers being much more likely, I think, to be present at the child's birth, and you probably don't have data from previous cohorts on that, but has there been any effort, or is it at all feasible to make comparisons for secular changes, because you do have data over such a long period, from 46 to 2002, and if there are secular changes in the things that were measured, it's a long enough period to identify them.
Well, the secular change is quite interesting because questions were asked in completely different ways in the 1950s. You know, all that we know about children's emotional problems in the 46 cohort is whether they wet the bed. So that's the indicator for emotional problems in a child is questions about bedwetting and questions to health visitors and teachers about the child's behavioural problems. The mothers weren't asked, or certainly not the fathers weren't asked. The secular change is taking extreme. In the 46 cohort, your informants are professionals. Mothers are slight, and possibly the mothers for some information. And in the Millennium cohort, you can't ask the professionals because they're too busy or it's not ethical or whatever. And you can ask mothers and fathers. And you ask them at frequent intervals in early childhood. And you have fairly well stabilised instruments that have been used in other surveys. And we use the Goodman's Strengths and Difficulties questionnaire, which we claim can be compared with the child behaviour checklist. I don't know if you'd agree, but we do. I tried to do a time series on this social and emotional skills of children, and the stuff asked in the 1946 cohort was just no way comparable. Parenting was not invented, so there weren't questions about parenting. One information we do have about parenting behaviour, say in the 58 cohort, is the teacher's assessment of the parents' interest in schooling, which itself has a very interesting category in the response, which is this parent or this mother is over interested.
I know that's bad.
It turns out people who've analysed it can't find any difference whether the parent is interested or over interested. Taken together, they both predict good outcomes in the labour market.
Okay, so the answer may be basically no. I think there were enough items in common, at least between the 58 and 70 assessments of problems based on mothers' reports, that some comparisons were possible, but it was a very small number of items. But I think, what you're saying is the answer is really no. Thank you.
Buen día. La pregunta para Ger apunta primero a recoger un poquito algunos trabajos de ella previos, donde ha mostrado cómo la transición a la maternidad, el inicio de la maternidad en Reino Unido ha estado asociado a un proceso de polarización, con una creciente diferencia entre la edad en la que las mujeres tienen sus primeros hijos, entre los sectores con mayores y menores recursos, y se sabe que la edad del primer hijo está fuertemente asociada con los recursos que dispone el hogar, con términos económicos, educativos, y probablemente también con un contexto conyugal, de pareja o de arreglos familiares en el hogar. Pero la pregunta que le quería plantear es si existe evidencia o sumaria evidencia en función de los trabajos realizados con las cortes en Reino Unido sobre el efecto de la edad del primer hijo en los estilos de prácticas de crianza, en términos de si eso refleja una mayor o menor preparación emocional o madurez para enfrentar la crianza. Gracias.
I have done some. Okay. I have done some analysis of the cognitive and behaviour outcomes of 5-year-old children in the Millennium cohort, according to the age that their mothers had their first child. So not necessarily the cohort child themselves, but were they a very young mother? So the immediate correlation is that the younger the mother, the worse the performance of the child. But when you include social structures, education, income, housing, you explain it all. This doesn't mean to say that it's not bad to be a young mother, but that the young mothers encounter such relatively poor circumstances that is sufficient to account for why the children aren't flourishing. Now, I didn't include measures of parenting behaviour, but it didn't look as if the parenting behaviour would have been subsumed as correlated with the social structure rather than correlated with the age. The age got eliminated by the structural behaviour.